This is the Dell Latitude E6510, a business class laptop from 2010, and a laptop that I actually made a video on when I got it, back in February of this year. It's been obviously many months since then, and I thought that now is the perfect time to go ahead and do a follow-up video on this laptop, now that I've been able to spend some time with it. I don't know how much this exact laptop retailed for, but taking a look at Dell's website from 2010, the lowest end model of the new E6510 in May of 2010, when this exact one would have been new, retailed for $769. Nice. The only differences in that one and mine is that the lowest end one started with 1GB of DDR3 RAM, and it came with Windows Vista Home Basic. This one started out at 2GB of RAM and had Windows 7 with downgrade rights to Windows XP, according to the service tag. So obviously those changes would be reflected in the price, and I would imagine it was more expensive than that. But otherwise, the rest of this thing's specs are exactly the same as the base model on Dell's website, including the Intel Core i5 520M dual-core processor, a 160GB 5400RPM hard drive, a Dell Wireless 1501 module, and a 6-cell 60Wh battery. The only changes to this system when I got it is it's been upgraded from 2GB of RAM to 4GB of RAM, and it also didn't have an OS on it, but otherwise everything was still original. Of course, since I got this system, I've upgraded it with some better components, including the OS upgrade video, if you will, where I upgraded it to 8GB of RAM and a 500GB hard drive. This is basically just the older version of the various other Latitudes that I already have, and this one is in fairly good condition for its age, which is why I've hung on to it. As always, starting with features on this PC, on the front we have the latch for the display, and that's it. On the right side of the laptop we have an express card slot, with the blank still in it, the DVD-ROM drive, including its latching mechanism to be able to remove it easily, a smart card slot, wireless switch, mini FireWire port, headphone and microphone jacks, and two USB 2.0 ports. On the back of the laptop we have the blank for the modem, gigabit Ethernet port, the battery, VGA port with the screws, and the DC in jack. On the left side of the laptop we have the Kensington lock slot, two more USB 2.0 ports, with one of them doubling as an eSATA port, display port, the cooling vent, a mini express card slot, an SD card slot, and the hard drive bay. Now the lid of this laptop is kind of an interesting case, not with the specific one, but rather the specific model, because you could have actually gotten this computer in either blue or red, which would have been awesome to have, but this one's just gray. It's at least in good condition. There's some minor scratches and stuff on it, but it's pretty good otherwise. You'd really have to go looking for it. Just like the E6420, this one also has some LEDs for power on and battery charge on the lid. On the bottom of the laptop, we have the aforementioned 60Wh battery, which is original from Dell and still holds a charge. It works for about an hour and a half, which is pretty good for a 14-year-old battery. Underneath it is also the Windows 7 COA and a SIM card slot. We also have the Dell docking base connector, as well as the service tag info. There's also some ventilation on the bottom cover, and all four rubber feet are still intact on this machine. Finally, the bottom cover, which on this laptop has to be probably one of my favorite ever. The only thing holding it down is a single spring-loaded screw. And then it just lifts off and you get access to pretty much everything you could want in the system. Every major component at least. Starting off, we have the aforementioned DVD-ROM drive, which could have been a DVD writer, but this one just didn't come with that. Unlike the E6420, the locking mechanism for this one is a little different, so it's not quite a drop-in replacement, but it functions exactly the same. Despite this having a Dell label, it was manufactured by Teak. This drive is a little annoying because if you wanted to replace it, you'd have to buy an OEM drive because the cover that goes into this locking mechanism actually extends down, so the locking mechanism screws right into the cover of the drive. So if you wanted that mechanism, you'd have to buy a OEM drive. On the bottom by where the locking mechanism goes, there is a screw hole, so you could lock this drive in place if you didn't want somebody easily removing it. But I haven't bothered to do that on this computer. There's no point. Next to that, we have the 8GB of DDR3 RAM. This computer can do up to 16 gigs, but it has to be 1067 megahertz RAM. It won't boot with anything faster, and I don't have anything that is that speed and also the right capacity. But 8 gigs is plenty for a machine like this. On the other side, we have the 240 gigabyte SSD that I added in this computer afterwards. It's one of the crucial M500s that was in the DC7600. It's a long story, but one of those drives ended up in this computer. It's a huge upgrade over both of the hard drives this had previously. Also down here is the spot for the Latitude on reader. As far as I'm aware, this housed another operating system that was very lightweight if you wanted to do basic things on your computer without having to wait for it to fully boot up. But that's not equipped on this one. Above that, we have the heatsink for the aforementioned Core i5 520M dual-core processor with a big gap next to it where there would be an NVIDIA graphics chip if this computer had one. However, there isn't, so there's a big gap here. This also, of course, means that this is the lesser cooler with only a single heat pipe. Now, the cooling situation in this laptop is one of the issues I've had with it. In this case, not the heatsink itself, but rather the fan. It doesn't work right. About a month after I got this thing, I started having some goofy fan behavior with it. It still works, but the system can't communicate properly with the fan. Instead, it just spins erratically and can't actually spin up when the processor gets pretty hot. It doesn't seem like functionality is really affected otherwise, and I don't have a direct replacement fan, so I just have yet to really bother, because one of the other things I have considered doing, even though it's completely unnecessary with the system, would be to track down an NVIDIA motherboard to put in this computer so that it has the GPU. I haven't done that with this yet because I'm lazy, but boards are out there which would either way involve the board and the fan to be replaced. The two things I think realistically could be causing that issue. I don't know, it's a product for another day. Next we have the CMOS battery, which is entirely dead and I might as well just take out of this system, and a spot for the mobile broadband card if this computer had that. Now, one of the things that you might expect to find under here is the Wi-Fi card, which isn't immediately accessible. It turns out that it's actually hidden underneath a separate cover next to the battery. I had to figure this out because the original Wi-Fi card in this machine ended up kind of dying while I was doing the OS upgrades video back in February. It's buried underneath the display cable, but the Wi-Fi card is there. And like I said, the original Dell Wi-Fi card kind of crapped its pants, so this is a Realtek Wi-Fi N card that I just had laying around, and it works better than the original, so it's good enough for me. Now the other side also does have a cover too, but it doesn't actually have anything underneath it except for where they ran the modem cable for the phone jack, which is frankly kind of clever, I guess. Of course, this doesn't have a modem installed, so that cable just goes to nothing. Overall, fairly good laptop to disassemble and replace components on. It's fairly easy, as you would expect from a business laptop of its time. But even compared to other Latitudes, this is probably my favorite. The Palmrest of this laptop is also, in my opinion, better than newer Latitudes that replaced it because it doesn't use that stupid soft touch rubber finish that my E6420 used. It's just hard plastic, but what it means is that it won't deteriorate nearly as badly over time. So despite this being such an old computer, the Palmrest is still in very good condition because there's no rubber to deteriorate on it. We can see the average size touchpad, which also doesn't have rubber buttons. Instead, they're just these clicky plastic buttons, which is fairly average for the time. As well as the keyboard, which isn't the best keyboard that's ever lived, but it is a pretty good keyboard for its time. It has a pretty decent feeling to it, and a pretty nice sound considering laptop keyboards at least. It's better than the Latitude keyboards that replaced it, like on the E6420 in my opinion. It isn't a backlit keyboard, but you can buy one for this machine, maybe an upgrade I'll do later. Of course, this keyboard also has a track point with its various buttons. And also on the keyboard next to the brightness controls is this auto control. This machine actually has an ambient light sensor in it, can control the brightness, you can toggle it with this key. Interestingly, the Latitudes that replaced this one don't appear to have this feature quite the same way. Something else about this keyboard is that it doesn't have a number pad, which means that there is a fair bit amount of space on the sides of the keyboard for the speakers, which don't sound amazing, but they get the job done. We also have some volume controls, the LEDs for numlock, caps lock, and scroll lock, and some indicators for hard drive, battery charge, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and cellular. Of course, these last two I've never seen light up because this computer doesn't have either of those modules. And we have the power button, which is a weird situation on this system because even with the battery charge, the system doesn't turn on when you press the power button. Instead, how you turn the system on is you have to hold the power button, and then it turns on. I don't know why, but that's just how it is apparently. We can also see the Latitude on button next to the power button. If you press this to go into that aforementioned Latitude on operating environment. Also, there's a lonely Core i5 sticker at the bottom of the Palmrest. For the display, we have a 15.6-inch 1366 by 768 panel, the lowest N1. Of course, you could get a higher resolution display, but this doesn't have that, and honestly, it really isn't that big of a deal to me. This machine also doesn't have a webcam, it's just a blank, but it does have a stereo microphone. And I believe this is the ambient light sensor. Now the BIOS on this computer is kind of weird. It's just that it's really slow to boot up. It seems like it gets caught up over the hard drive somehow, but eventually it gets there. I updated the system to the latest version, A17 from 2017. This thing had BIOS version A01 on it when I got it, because it was a very early E6510 manufactured on May 29th, 2010, and the original owner took ownership of it in July of 2010. Updating the BIOS on this computer was actually a whole fun story. Because it's running such an old BIOS revision, I had to update it to about 3 or 4 other BIOS revisions first, with one of them no longer being available on Dell's website. So I had to track it down on Softonic, of all places, which is definitely not the place you probably want to be downloading your BIOS updates from, but that's what you have to do. Thanks, Dell. But it got there, so clearly it must have been at least somewhat legit. Otherwise, we can see our various information for the RAM, the processor, the SSD, the DVD drive, typical things, including the Wi-Fi device that shows up as unknown because it's a replacement card. It has no idea what it is. The battery on this thing is still in good enough condition that the BIOS isn't freaking out. Obviously, I'm running it off of it for this demo. This computer has a very early type of UEFI on it, though it's not actually true UEFI. It still was a bit early for that. But it still has it in the BIOS, and I use it anyway, because why not? The only other noteworthy things in this BIOS compared to the E6421 is we have an option for the Latitude on reader, the ambient light sensor. This has an option for TPM security, but it's not enabled, as well as CompuTrace, which is thankfully turned off, Fast Boot, which is set to thorough out of the box, which might explain why it takes so long to do anything, and all of the system logs, which there are a lot of. This thing has had several things that have been recorded in here, including RAM issues and the fan malfunction from earlier, and the time when I plugged it into an HP power supply and it didn't appreciate it very much. As always for Dells, in the boot menu, whenever this thing wants to actually do something, there's an option for onboard diagnostics. Just like the E6420, except it's really like the XPS M1530 because it's the older Dell Diagnostics program, not the GUI one that was on the newer Latitudes. Even with the BIOS update, this system did not get the newer diagnostics thing, but it still works the same. Now as for the operating system, this thing is running Zorin OS. Obviously, I did a whole video upgrading this to Windows 11 and Kubuntu. So what happened to that? Well, because I put in a smaller SSD than the hard drive that was in this system, I wasn't able to clone that install over. But why Zorin OS? Well, I wanted to try something different, and so I threw it on this computer. It's definitely far from the best choice in my opinion for this system because it doesn't run that great. In this case, the biggest issue with this system isn't the RAM or the SSD, though they absolutely do help, but rather that old dual-core processor with the pretty old HD graphics. Means that when you open things, it'll do it, but the CPU usage is all over the place. Of course, this system can be used for basic productivity work. I did a lot of that on here when I was out of another laptop, and it did it just fine. The keyboard and everything is great for that. But it definitely does struggle with a lot of things, like internet browsing, which would work if it wasn't for the fact that my internet was down while I was recording this. Fortunately, that's why I have a hotspot. Anyway, this system can do internet browsing, but as I said, the CPU usage is all over the place. It's working very hard to actually be able to do it. Something more intensive like video playback can't really be done on this computer without it stuttering a lot, even at 480p. Probably doesn't help that the graphics support in general on this operating system just isn't really that great on this computer. Speaking of frying a computer, how about trying to run games on it anyway, even though it was never meant to do that? I did install a couple of my older games from the 2000s just to see how they would do on this system, and the results absolutely will not shock you. Flatout was so slow to load on this system that I genuinely left to go do something else while I waited for it to load. But eventually it did it, and it runs about as well as I could expect. In fact, the CPU is struggling so bad with this that it can't even register keyboard inputs until far too late. Half-Life 2 launched at a very cool 640 by 480. I could barely even see the options window. It's better than 1 FPS in Flatout, but I wouldn't say it's great either. It is technically playable, the frame rate's a lot better, it's around 20 FPS. But the thing that I noticed with this computer is that when you're using the keyboard, you can't use the trackpad at the same time. So you either have to plug in a mouse or you have to play on the track point. Guess which one I did? The track point on this thing is so sensitive, at least under Linux. That's one of the things I don't like about this thing. This is probably more of a me thing since I have a hard time using track points at all. It just seems really sensitive to me though, compared to other laptops. It means trying to use it, unsurprisingly, is hard. Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 didn't fare much better. Got a whole 1 FPS. In fact, it was so bad that while playing it, the Steam FPS counter decided it didn't want to live anymore. By setting it to high performance settings, the machine was able to go from 1 FPS to 3 FPS. And that is what I call an improvement. Yeah, if it wasn't already clear, this is not a gaming laptop. It was never meant to be a gaming laptop when it was new, and it's definitely not a gaming laptop now. It doesn't help that all of these games have been updated since they came out. In fact, the greatest game of all time doesn't even launch on it at all. As far as other ways to fry the machine, I have VirtualBox on this computer, but it doesn't actually do any virtual machines, though I'm kind of thinking that's more of VirtualBox being a piece of crap rather than this computer, since I've gotten it to work before. The DVD drive on this machine is a weird one. When I first got the machine, it seemed really slow to me. Like, to boot my Windows 7 DVD, it took a very long time. Because this is running Linux, I don't have image burn on this, but instead I have Power ISO on it, and I attempted to make an ISO file using the drive. And it took around 10 minutes. I don't have any direct point of comparison, but I tried using the same program on the E6410 with a similar optical drive, and it did about the same speed. So this DVD drive is fine. This is kind of around the time when optical drives kind of peaked and we didn't really see any obvious improvements. This drive is also fairly quiet, at least when it's doing things, compared to other optical drives that I've seen, so I'll give it that. The speakers on this thing are fine, the clarity's alright, but they are kinda tinny and they don't get very loud. In this clip, the speakers are at max volume. But for watching videos and stuff, it's fine. Well that works. Now this thing originally came with Windows XP Media Center Edition. That's right, I thought this was a joke at first, but it turns out HP actually shipped this thing as a Media Center PC. I mean, to be fair, anything can be a Media Center PC, but usually you associate that with something high-end. Now I'm kind of expecting to get comments about how I'm stupid for even bothering to install this operating system on this computer at all. And there's a certain bit of validity to it. It doesn't really run that well on this computer. I did have Kubuntu on it with KDE, which also didn't run very well on this computer. I might try a more lightweight distro or maybe something with XFCE, I don't know, but this is what I had in the time that I had. I will say, with this computer, my experience with it is that really any modern operating system just doesn't really run that great on it. What this computer really is a Windows 7 machine. This isn't a Linux issue at all in my opinion. Rather, it's more of Dell and Intel's problem. Dell themselves didn't even bother to make any drivers for Windows 8, and Intel never really updated any of these old graphics chipsets or anything to work with Windows 10 or anything newer. So really, outside of Windows 7, anything else just kind of doesn't really run that great on this system. Maybe I'll consider reinstalling Windows 7 and then maybe some other lighter weight Linux distro alongside it, but a project for another day, I guess. But as a basic laptop for basic stuff, like web browsing or documents or email or whatever you might want to do, it's still fine. The system could also have other upgrades as well, like a quad-core processor, to make it better than that. It's not just the operating system. This thing is definitely far from being fully upgraded. From what I've heard, first-gen Intel is just kind of crap, so I definitely wouldn't pin a whole lot of this blame onto Zorin OS or Linux at all. But regardless, I'm still glad I got it. It still held up relatively well, and maybe it could be even better with some more upgrades in the future. Maybe that'll be a future video.